Why is the English spoken today so different than the English spoken 200 years ago, 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago? Have you observed the English language changing within your lifetime? In this short video, I'm going to talk about why languages change. What are some of the causes of language change? One of the causes of language change is articulatory simplification. The language changes to make it easier to pronounce. There are words that are hard to pronounce that become easier to pronounce. One explanation for it is the law of economy. The organs of speech, instead of taking a new position for each sound, tend to draw sounds together with the purpose of saving time and energy. Over time, many of these economical changes may be conventionalized and accepted. This definition is still a bit narrow, though. The changes we talk about are usually economical. They save time and energy. But they don't always involve the organs of speech taking new positions to draw sounds together, as is defined here. They might involve dropping sounds entirely. But one of the ways we might economize is by bringing together sounds. Why do people sometimes say would ya, could ya, or did ya instead of would you, could you, or did you? The last consonant of would is a stop made on the alveolar ridge. The d sound is made as a stop on the alveolar ridge. The y sound is a palatal approximant. So this means that for the d sound, the tongue is higher and probably a little bit further forward than for the j sound. If you look about halfway between these two sounds, you'll see another one that you should recognize, the j sound, which when combined with the alveolar stop d makes the affricate j. You can hear this affricate in would ya, could ya, did ya, would ya, could ya, did ya. Now this is not an example of language change yet, but it is an example of articulatory simplification. Is it possible that in 500 years would ya becomes the dictionary form? What would slow down that articulatory simplification? Does having a written form hinder the oral form from changing, for example? So one of the causes of language change is articulatory simplification. Another one is regularization. The language changes to make it more regular. The language changes to reduce exceptions. Again, the language may be changing in this way because it's easier. It's easier to have things regular. It's easier to have a rule than to learn the exceptions and the rule. So as with articulatory simplification, regularization involves language changing so that it's easier for its users. Not just its users, but its learners as well. Children learning their first language, or learning English as their first language, display a U-shaped pattern of acquiring morphemes, and this pattern points to the difficulty of learning exceptions. In the first stage, the child learns in irregular but salient form. In the second stage, the child learns the rule. In the third stage, the child generalizes the rule to the irregular form. And in the fourth stage, the child begins to apply the rule while recognizing exceptions. So, for example, looking at the first stage, which do you think this young learner is more likely to hear? The difference between love and loved, or the difference between go and went? The difference in form between go and went is much more salient. The past tense of many irregular verbs in English is more salient than the past tense of many regular verbs. The kids will hear and acquire went before they acquire the rule of adding ed endings. So they've gone through the first stage. In the first stage, the child is using the past tense of go correctly. Then they learn the rule, and they learn that you can say loved. But when they learn this rule, when they learn you can start saying loved, they start saying goed. So now, something they were doing well, they are doing poorly, even though they're progressing in their language learning. So they're starting to use an incorrect form where they used to use a correct one. And then, over time, they begin to learn the exceptions, and they begin to apply the rule to most of the forms in a useful way, but not to the exceptions. So they are doing it right again. So they're displaying this U-shaped language acquisition. The example I gave was for children learning their first language, but you do see the same U-shaped patterns in second language acquisition. But in either case, that's change in the learner or change within the child's performance of the language. It's not change in the language itself. We do see this regularization happening to the language itself because it makes it simpler. So irregular forms will gradually become regularized. I think we can predict one example of regularization. I think that in, say, the next 50 years, creeped will have completely replaced crept as the past tense form of the verb creep. Crept is still the more accepted form, but the past tense creeped has begun to creep into our language and into some dictionaries. Now, a third cause of language change is language contact. Languages change as a result of contact between the speakers of one language group and the speakers of another language group, especially when this contact continues for an extended period of time. We've talked about borrowing before. Lexical borrowing is quite common. More intense and prolonged contact is probably needed for the borrowing of syntax. It's easier to add words to your lexicon than it is to change the rules with which the language is spoken. Familiar with the expression, "the sun never sets on the British Empire"? Well, that being the case, the English language has come into contact with many different languages around the world. And this results in English picking up lots of new words, lots of new nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs. It doesn't result in as much syntactic borrowing. So those three causes of language change are articulatory simplification, regularization, and language contact.